Hey everyone, welcome back. It's Type of Sleep Clever, and today we're going to be learning how to master manual mode with your camera. So getting a proper exposure is allowing enough light through the lens onto your camera's sensor, or if you're shooting film, onto the film, in order to capture the subject and the environment appropriately. So to achieve a proper exposure, you have to balance it between three things: aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. Okay, and it has to serve a purpose. Okay, and the key word there is purpose. You can apply your camera settings almost like a painter applies brush strokes to the canvas. That means you can create certain effects and aesthetics if you use your camera settings with appropriate control. So you might be a new photographer just starting out, and you're placing your camera in auto mode, which is a perfectly normal thing to do. You know, as you develop your purpose and what you want to capture with your camera, the auto modes might not be capturing the way you envision. Say you want to freeze the motion of something and your camera captures it in a different way and the subject's all blurry, or the background's blown out and the subject is super dark. So knowing what the settings do and shooting in manual allow you to use the auto modes with more control and more efficiency as you progress into like busier environments and things like that, and you have to use auto modes. So one way we can think of your camera settings and the way they work together to capture the subject you have in mind is like, pretend you're in the desert, you live in the desert, and you're trying to control the AC of your house. Usually you might have it set to like 78 degrees when you're there because you want to save some energy or whatever, but when your friends come over for lunch, you might decrease it to about 70 just so they're more comfortable, right? So what if Aunt Bertha comes over and, you know, she's 65 years old, she's always having hot flashes and stuff. You want to set it to like maybe 60 just to make her comfortable, right? So you're setting the AC in accordance to what your subject is. And that's kind of what we have to do with our camera. Our house is not going to know who comes in the front door, and it's not going to automatically set the AC settings to what we specifically want. Okay, it's not that smart. Just like our camera is not very smart either. It can change your settings, but it won't know exactly what you're trying to capture. So your job is to understand what your subject is and set your settings to how you want to capture it. And that's where this manual mode comes into play. You know, you're an artist, you want to capture it the way you envisioned it and create the aesthetics and the effects that you want. And that's how we should start thinking about these settings as artists, instead of, I just want to capture the image. No, you want to create something that's very beautiful, and you want to capture the picture in your head. Let's learn exactly how to shoot in manual mode, and we'll see how closely it relates to the human eye. We'll briefly go over the settings, and then we'll dig into some images and explain why they were captured the way they are. So the shutter speed provides two functions, and it works in balance with aperture and ISO. So the first function is it controls the light, right? The second function is that it controls the length of time that an image is captured, okay? So we can imagine the shutter speed is like the way your eye blinks, okay? If you close your eyes and you blink really slow and then close them again, okay, you're letting in more light when you blink in slow as opposed to when you blink fast like that, right? So you blink slow, just like your shutter speed, and you let in more light. Okay, what also is happening is you're capturing the movement in the scene. Okay, you open your eyes a long time, you see whatever's moving in the scene, just like your camera does. You open your eyes fast and close them, you just see a fraction of a second of what's in the scene. Okay, and that's exactly how your camera records the image, all right? But if you open your eyes slow, it's gonna record all that movement into one single frame. That's why some of your images might be like super blurry or really, really light. That's because your camera, when it was set on auto mode or on manual mode and you didn't know how to control it, that means your camera was blinking too slow, right? It's letting in too much light and it's capturing too much movement. So the higher the shutter speed you have, the faster your camera is blinking and the less light it's letting in, right? It's just blinking super fast, okay? Your camera can actually be set at the highest shutter speed all the time if you want, as long as it's capturing the subject as you need and it's working with aperture and ISO to control the exposure, right? The only time you need a low shutter speed is when you're trying to adjust for the exposure, or you want to capture something that's a little bit like a longer exposure. Other than that, it can be as fast as you want. Okay, the aperture provides two functions as well. So it helps control the light, but it also controls the depth of field. And I'll explain what that is in a little bit. The aperture of your lens is actually like the iris of your eye. It dilates and contracts to control the amount of light you let into your lens, right? So say you're in Starbucks grabbing your favorite latte or the unicorn, frappuccino, and you go outside real quick and it's just like super bright and you squint and you're like, oh man, that's kind of like just your irises not having enough time to close up and block out some of the light. Okay, your camera does that too. The lens of your camera has the aperture and it just kind of squeezes shut to close out some of the light. These older SLR lenses, you can actually control the aperture. Let me show you. Kind of see how the aperture opens and closes, right? Just like the human eye. Okay, so just like the shutter speed, the higher it goes, the less light is let into the camera. So the same thing goes with aperture. The higher the aperture, the less light you get into the lens. The lowest aperture setting is wide, and then as you increase it, it gets smaller and smaller and smaller to let less light in. That's a good way to remember it. Less light is closed. So some people say, I shot it wide open. I shot my lens wide open. That just means it's wide open at the lowest aperture setting. So when we talk about depth of field, that might be a little bit confusing to some photographers. What is depth of field, right? But an easier way to think about it is what the aperture does is it controls the blurriness of the scene, right? Depth of field is kind of vague, but blurriness we all understand, right? So if you use a very low aperture, you're gonna have more blurriness. This is called bokeh. It's a Japanese word called bokeh, kind of like a bouquet of flowers. And a little bit, don't call it bokeh. Some people call it bokeh and they get laughed at, right? They get mocked. I don't know what the world's coming to, but...
Are you mocking me? Are you mocking me? Stop it, you just did it again. He's trying to copy you.
Bokeh, keep it bokeh. So if you want to capture a more aesthetically softer feel to your image, you'll use a lower aperture and have more bokeh in the background, right? It'll have a softer feel because it has that blurriness. If you don't want that blurriness and you want more of the subject and the environment to be in focus, you're going to increase the aperture, okay? It's gonna close down and get really tight and capture more of the scene in focus. So that's an easy way to think of depth of field. Aperture is just controlling the blurriness in the image. Do you want a lot of blurriness or do you want a little bit of blurriness? That's the easiest way to think about it. Aperture, how much blur? That's an easy way to think about it. Shutter speed, subject speed. That's another way you can think about that. Okay, now the last setting of the triangle, we've got shutter speed, aperture, and now we've got ISO to cover. So ISO is basically the way it relates to the human eye is when you're in the wilderness, it's super dark out, and your eyes have no more power to see anything in front of you. That's when ISO comes in handy. It's like a flashlight in the middle of the night. So your ISO is kind of like your camera's flashlight. It allows it to see more things. But what it's doing is basically it's making your camera sensor more sensitive to the light around it. ISO only serves one function, and that's to help control the exposure. So ISO is typically used as the last setting, mostly because it can have a negative effect on the final image. When you increase the ISO setting of your camera, the image will start to get more and more grainy. If you zoom in, you've got little dots of grain. If you're shooting digital, it's called noise. If you're shooting film, it's called grain. Sometimes it can be aesthetically pleasing to have a little bit of grain, but when it starts to degrade the quality of the image to where it's just like not very crisp, not very sharp, it's just kind of mushy. Usually the lower ISOs, you hardly ever see any difference in the final image unless you're zooming in really close. You can see a little bit of noise or grain. It's the higher ISOs, like 3200, 6400, especially if you're shooting with film, or older digital cameras will have a lot of noise in those settings, those higher settings. The modern digital cameras are getting better and better, and you can actually shoot pretty high. It's just something to be aware of. Some photographers prefer just a little bit of grain, a little bit of noise. It adds that vintage kind of nostalgic look to it. It's just something to be aware of when you're controlling your ISO. Usually keep it at the lowest setting and just raise it when you need just a little bit more light to help you create a proper exposure. So some good questions to ask yourself when you're shooting and learning to shoot in manual mode. Just keep your subject in mind. Do I want to freeze the subject, or do I want to create motion blur with the subject? Do I want a blurry background where the subject is, or do I want a lot of things in focus? Set these settings to what you've envisioned, and then you can adjust the ISO if you need to. If it's still underexposed, you can adjust the ISO to help you get a proper exposure. But you always want to keep your subject in mind and capture it the way you want to capture it, instead of the camera kind of guessing what you need. Okay, so let's run through some of these images. We'll look at the metadata here, the camera settings, and I'll explain why they are set that way. So this first one, I'm using a 50mm lens, and the max aperture is 1.4, and it shows right here that I took it with a 1.8 aperture, so it was pretty low, almost as low as it could go, which means we're going to get maximum bokeh. We want a shallow depth of field, which means low aperture. But what's going on with the high shutter speed? What is that all about? Why? She's laying very, very still. Why would I need a fast shutter speed? And then we've got the ISO set at 100, which is the lowest setting. So when we look at this one, we'll see that the low aperture creates that shallow depth of field. The bokeh in the background, see how her eye is very sharp, but just a few inches further back into the background, her hair is very, very blurry. So that's the bokeh, and that's the low aperture. But why did I use a fast shutter speed? She's laying very, very motionless. So the reason I did that was I didn't want to increase the aperture to try and control the light coming through. I didn't want to close off the aperture. You know how the aperture is kind of like the iris closing out the light of the image? But when you increase the aperture, you lose this blurriness, right? I didn't want to lose the blurriness, so I kept it very, very low. So the only other option I could adjust to close out some of the light was the shutter speed. So I closed the shutter speed out as far as I needed to get a proper exposure. And then I had the ISO set very low so I wouldn't have any digital noise or anything like that. So that's why I had the shutter speed set so high. Remember, the shutter speed can be as high as you want as long as it's capturing the subject as you need, right? But my needs here for this subject were to keep the shallow depth of field, the blurriness. That was my main priority. Okay, and then I just adjusted the shutter speed to compensate for that exposure. So that's that one. And this one is you can see the blurriness in the background. Let's look at the settings here. So the aperture was very shallow in this one. It's set at 2, which means it's very low. It's going to give us some of that nice blurriness in the background, right? The bokeh. But why did I have my shutter speed set at 1/1600th of a second? Why did I do that? And this one's a little bit more evident. It's because I wanted to freeze some of these water droplets in the air bouncing off of my head. If we look closer, we can see that the water that bounces off my head kind of loses that momentum and slows down a bit, and we're able to capture some crisp droplets here and there, But this one coming out of the hose has more velocity, more speed, so it's got that motion blur. The shutter speed was only set at 1/1600th of a second, so that's why we were seeing some of this motion blur. If I wanted to freeze some of this water coming out of the hose, I'd have to increase the shutter speed to help slow down and freeze the moment in time, right? So I balanced the aperture with the shutter speed and the ISO. Okay, so here's another one. This one will show the water. The settings are a little bit different. I wanted more of the face in focus, so the aperture is set at f8. So that's getting most of her face in focus, and then it's getting this is actually milk coming down. I'm having someone dump milk on her face, which is kind of funny. But you can see how the milk droplets aren't frozen in time. See, the shutter speed is only 1/250th of a second, right? That's kind of slow if you're trying to freeze motion. But in this case, it adds an aesthetically pleasing kind of look to it. A little motion blur adds a little bit of movement to the entire image. So it's not all entirely a bad thing if it's not frozen. It's just kind of what you're going for with the image. So I balance that with the ISO of 200. So everything is working kind of together to create the image you see right here. So if I lowered the ISO to 100 to the lowest setting, I'd have to lower this shutter speed as well because I'm closing out light when I lower it. Because the ISO is like our flashlight, right? This one is a really old one, but it shows a nice way to get motion blur in broad daylight. I think I had my ND filter on, which I'll talk about later, but it was in the daylight. I had the filter on and the shutter speed was set at 1/4 of a second and the aperture was set at f8, so a lot of things would be in focus, right? Notice how there's not much blurriness in this one. That's because the aperture is a little bit higher. So I balanced that with the slow shutter speed with the ISO of 500. So why would I choose a higher ISO? Well, if I lowered the ISO, I would be losing out light, which means I would have to use a smaller aperture, which would mean less things in focus, right? I'd add more blurriness. And then I would have to slow this shutter speed down as well, which would make probably the waves a lot longer. There'd be a lot more motion blur if the shutter speed was like 1 second or more than that. But we could totally tell. You just have to gauge it of what the final image looks like and what you're going for. So are you starting to understand how the shutter speed can control the length of time a moment is captured? So we'll cover long exposures in a little bit, but let's move on to the aperture. Aperture is one of the more aesthetically pleasing settings that you can use. A lot of people don't really use long exposures, but the aperture is used to create that bokeh, so a lot of people use it, and sometimes it can be glorified, you know. It's bokeh-licious, right? Bokeh-licious. That's how they say it. I like more bokeh than, things to be in focus, especially if I'm doing portraits and things like that. But I'm always focused on my purpose, right? Street photography, I use a higher aperture because I want more things in focus. But if you're doing portrait work or creating a scene, in my case, I like more bokeh. So just do it according to your purpose and your subject and what kind of story you want to tell. It can be used in a strategic way in, say, weddings. You can use more bokeh to blur out busy distractions from the background. And that's especially good if you're a beginner because you don't really know about figure-ground relationship and how the subject should fit into the background, right? A lot of the professional or like landscape photographers and, say, fashion photographers, they use a higher aperture, but then they combine it with a knowledge of composition, and they can create nice visual clarity without using the bokeh as kind of like a tool to like blur out distractions because they don't know how to control it, right? They know how to control the composition, they know how to control the scene, and they're using a higher aperture to capture more in focus. So the aperture and the bokeh can be used strategically or aesthetically. It just depends on how you want to do it. So this image, let's look at the settings. We've got the lowest aperture possible on my lens. I'm using the 50mm lens again. It's 1.4. The shutter speed is 1/160th of a second, and the ISO is 250. Okay, so why did I use a higher ISO in this? So the aperture was set very low because I wanted this blurriness, right? Low setting on your aperture means lots of nice bokeh, right? So I didn't want to change that. So next up is shutter speed. How fast do I need my camera to blink? Well, in this case, I could have gone a little bit lower. I'm shooting handheld here. I could have gone maybe 1/60th of a second and lowered the ISO to 100. I could have done that, but this, you'll see this minor difference in exposure doesn't really make a difference, right? There is like, if I wanted a perfect exposure, perfect settings, whatever, which in this case, it doesn't really matter. I got the shot and I got it at proper exposure and nothing's blown out, nothing's showing motion blur, nothing's too grainy. This subtle difference doesn't even matter. But say I wanted a perfect setting, what would I get? I would probably lower the ISO, which means I would lower the shutter speed just a little bit. And it could probably go to the 1/60th. And the guideline that you can go with when you're shooting handheld is like if I'm shooting with the 50mm lens. So whatever the length of your lens is, you can translate that to the shutter speed. I can go down to about 1/60th of a second with my shutter speed while shooting handheld without getting a little bit of camera shake from, my hands moving, my body's moving, it's moving the camera, that's camera shake. So if I went with a lower shutter speed, like 1 second, and I was shooting handheld, then I'd start to get camera shake, a little bit of motion blur, and the face wouldn't be as crisp, right? It's pretty sharp right on her eyeball. For shooting with 1.4 handheld, you got to nail that focus, right? What I usually do is I use my LCD and I can zoom in with the magnifying glass on my LCD, get the manually focus perfectly right on the eyeball, zoom back out from the LCD, and then take the picture. It's easier than it sounds, but that's how I get really sharp focus with these low apertures. I just use my LCD to get the perfect focus. Okay, so in this case, this one right here, I've got a very low shutter speed. I've got ISO 400, and the aperture is very low as well. I'm shooting, it's actually in the jungle and it's kind of getting dark, and the aperture 1.8 is going to give us more blurriness, but that's usually only when there's a lot of depth. In this case, there's not much depth, right? A lot of the image is mainly on the same plane, which is like flat. Her eyes are on the same plane as this water and these petals. So, and you can zoom in on this. I use the same technique to get sharp focus on her eyes. So I've got the low aperture, I don't want to touch that. The shutter speed is very, very slow. It's 1/25 of a second. But the cool thing is, like I was saying, with the focal length of your lens, I'm actually shooting with a 20mm lens, so I'm able to go a little bit slower with my shutter speed and not risk that camera shake, right? Some lenses have that stabilization in it as an option, and you can shoot a little bit lower than your focal length. But as a guideline, usually the focal length determines the safe shutter speed that you can shoot at when shooting handheld, to avoid that camera shake. So speaking of focal planes, right? Let's go into this next image. This one is a perfect example of how the aperture creates that bokeh, and if you use a shallow depth of field, it can change as things get closer to the lens or if things are further away from the lens. So we can see this, I'm using an aperture of 2.8, which is pretty low. The shutter speed is 1/250 and the ISO is 200. So my settings are really pretty low, and the 250 is enough to kind of freeze these pieces of candy falling from the sky, but you can see a little bit of motion blur, right? But the cool thing is I'm using that low aperture. I'm focusing on her face, making sure her eyes are crisp and nice, but you can see how the blurriness increases the closer these candy orbs get to the lens. So these are focal planes, like this is one plane, the bigger ones, and you can see how blurry it is, right? This is another focal plane, these medium-sized ones, and then these smaller ones, which are more sharp. So as they move from the lens back towards the focal point, which is her eyeballs, they get more and more focused. And as they move closer to the lens, they'll get more and more blurry. So that's a cool little technique that you can use to create depth in your image and an aesthetically kind of pleasing effect. Here's the same thing. This is called figure-ground relationship reversal. So instead of the foreground being in perfect focus, usually the foreground is in focus and the background's blurry. In this case, it's reversed. The foreground is blurry and the background is in focus. So this is what I call figure-ground relationship reversal. So what you do is you focus on the subject in the distance and whatever's closer to the lens. In this case, the girl is very close and she's nice and blurry, which creates a different story. So it just depends on the story you're trying to tell in the image you're creating. But understanding how these settings affect the final image is key to becoming a professional and exactly what you're doing. Here's another one where the focus is in on the distance and then the subject, that's me standing there, it's more in bokeh. So that's a nice little technique. This one's too, right? This shows 3 focal planes, pretty obvious. One's very close, this one's super blurry. She's the main focal point, so she's in focus, and then the background's a little bit blurrier. And the settings to that one, we've got f2, it's a low aperture, which means shallow depth of field, more blurriness. The shutter speed is 1/100th and the ISO is 500. So why do I have the ISO 500? Well, the aperture is at the lowest setting I want because I want that blurriness in the front, the blurriness in the background. I want her kind of sandwiched in between the bokeh. And then the shutter speed is low enough to capture a little bit of movement in the water, not too much. If I went slower to reduce some of the ISO, which was 500, the water would get more and more long. It'd start turning into a long exposure and the water would be longer. But the difficult part with that slower shutter speed would be that I would risk camera shake. I'm shooting with a 50mm lens, so I could go down to maybe 1/60th of a second. You know, that's the lowest I could go with that focal length safely. She's kind of moving because the water's kind of pushing her around. She's trying to stay still. I'm shooting in the water. I'm trying to stay still, and then the water in the background's moving, and then the flames in the foreground are moving. So I've got a little bit more shutter speed just to help freeze more of the motion that's happening in the scene. So that means I had to use more ISO to create a proper exposure. Okay, so with aperture, remember I was saying the closer something gets to the lens, the more blurry it is? If you're shooting with a low aperture and you're expecting bokeh, you're expecting a lot of blurriness, it all depends on where you're focusing. If you're focusing far away like this image, distance is like kryptonite to bokeh.
You were great in your day, Superman.
If you're focusing far away like this, the distance from her to the lens is quite a lot. So I'm not getting that bokeh. Like this tree isn't nice and blurry like you would expect, right? Because I'm using a aperture of 2.8, which is very low, just like one of these. Let's see. That one's 2.8, but look at all the blurriness. Because I'm closer, this is closer to the lens than this subject, okay? She's far away. So we're focused far away, which means it's kryptonite for our bokeh, which is fine because I'm shooting in a low lit environment, so I need all of that aperture to let in more light and keep this ISO low. So I use 2.8. That keeps sufficient amount of things in focus, you know, as they increase with the distance. You can see a little bit of blurriness behind the tree, which is nice, and it adds a nice aesthetic, soft feeling to it. And nothing's like super sharp. And I'm probably shooting maybe with the tripod, but this is the 20mm, looks like. So I could go a little bit slower with my shutter speed. It's 1/60th now. It's pretty low already, but I could go a little bit lower to like 1/20th if I needed to let in more light. And that could drop this ISO down to 100. So that's just working with your lens capabilities, your settings, and your model, and the scene, and everything, all the lighting that's available, all to balance a perfect exposure while also capturing what you've envisioned kind of in your head and how you want the scene to look. I bought this, it was a 20mm 1.8 Sigma lens, and I bought it when I was kind of still learning photography and what aperture did to the scene and all that stuff. So I remember shooting with this lens, and I remember shooting far away like this, and I was expecting that nice bokeh creaminess, you know, the creamy blurry background, but I didn't get it, and I was like, what's going on? Why is all this stuff in focus still? And that's when I've kind of learned how wide angles work. They actually make the image, the actual scene, wider than what it is, which is actually increasing the distance. It's creating that distortion. So when you're shooting with a wide angle lens on that low aperture, you've still got quite a bit of distance from the actual model to the lens. It sounds kind of weird, but it's, you know, it's just the way that distortion works with wide angle lenses. You're actually theoretically like further away from the subject. So to get that blurriness with a wide angle lens and a low aperture, you actually got to get closer to the subject, much closer. And that leads us into this next section. Okay, so now that we know that the closer the subject is to the lens, the more bokeh we'll have in the background, we can understand kind of what macro shots will look like. Macro shots are usually really close to the lens, a lot closer than most lenses can focus. So the closer you are, if you're using a small aperture, you're going to have a really shallow depth of field, which means very little of the subject is going to be focused, right? So if you're shooting a macro shot of a bug or a wedding ring, you're going to have to increase the aperture if you want more of the subject in focus. So keep that in mind if you want to shoot macro shots, especially if you're a wedding photographer or whatever. And I'll show you this wedding shot that I got. All right, so in this dramatic wedding ring shot, the settings actually are being put to the test, and you kind of have to know a little bit of what you need and what you want and what the settings do to control this kind of shot. So let's look a little bit closer. We've got the aperture at 3.5, which is kind of low. It's kind of in between very low and medium level aperture. The shutter speed is pretty high actually. It's 1/1000th of a second, and the ISO is kind of high also, which is ISO 800. It's not too high, you know, for a full frame camera you probably won't see much noise, but let's look a little bit closer. So we've got a lot going on. We've got bokeh in the background. We've got the water being frozen in time. I'm spraying water over the wedding ring to try and freeze it, kind of like that shot, with my, shooting myself in the head. I'm trying to freeze the water like that, right? I could have gone a little bit faster with the shutter speed, but then that would mess up the other settings. So let's start with the aperture. It's 3.5, so if I went lower than 3.5, probably we would only have maybe this first section of the diamond in focus instead of like maybe towards the back of the middle section. We've got enough in focus to present it to the client and, say, here's your wedding ring. Here's a cool shot for you. If we decrease the aperture, we would have just a super sliver in focus and it probably wouldn't look that good. Now, I could have increased the aperture and had the whole diamond in focus. Maybe I could have increased it to like f8 and had the whole diamond in focus, but what would that do? That would get rid of some of the blurriness in the background, right? And I really wanted the blurriness. They're called fairy lights. They're like little Christmas lights that run on a battery. So I've got tin foil underneath right here to reflect some light, catch some water droplets. I've got fairy lights in the background, and that shallow depth of field, the low aperture, is creating these circles of light right here, these bokeh lights. And it's kind of a nice dreamy effect. So I didn't want to touch the aperture anymore, and if I started with a low shutter speed and tried capturing this water, the water would just be a blur. Like you can see up here where we're losing light and it's off to the side, maybe it's moving a little bit quicker, it's just blurry. But right here where it's in the light, it's being frozen with the light and the fast shutter speed, we're able to freeze some of the movement of the water droplets. Now it could go a little bit faster, to freeze more of the water droplets, but if we did that, then we'd have to increase the ISO a lot more. And when you can look at these dark areas, like you can see, this is the digital noise I was talking about. You can see all that kind of grain, which is not too bad, but the more you increase that ISO, the worse it gets, especially in these dark kind of mid-tone areas and stuff. That was probably the best settings I could come up with, when during a busy wedding day and, it being very hectic and it being a very experimental shot. So this one was actually taken in 2010 when I didn't really know what my camera settings were doing and I didn't know anything about exposure, whatever. I didn't know anything really. I took this on auto mode, and you can see the settings here, this auto bracket mode, which I did and I'll talk about next. So the camera kind of just guessed, and I got f7.1, which was lucky, on my part, because it's a 300 millimeter lens, but it's got it's like a cheap lens, Sigma 300 millimeter with a macro option. So I'm kind of like maybe 7 feet away from this little anole here. It's a little lizard. I'm about 6 or 7 feet away from him, but the macro option on the lens is allowing me to get a little bit closer, and with that higher aperture of 7.1, I'm kind of getting more in focus of the anole. If that was a lower aperture, then maybe none of it would be in focus. And you can see like my focus isn't perfect. I'm doing autofocus instead of the LCD technique I was talking about earlier. You can see how there's more focus on the forefront of this little tree here instead of like right on the eyeball of the lizard. And then this looks nice and in focus here, but you can see it fall off as the distance increases. The shutter speed is 1/400th of a second, which actually could have been lower because this little lizard, he's not moving at all, sitting there. So I could have lowered that. I could have increased the aperture to get more depth, to get a little bit less blurriness. And I could have lowered the ISO, a little bit, but it's not very high. It's 125. It only goes a little bit lower. But that's the main difference of shooting with an auto mode. I actually got lucky on this shot because usually the camera doesn't know what you're trying to shoot, as it's revealing here. It didn't know, the lizard was just sitting there, and it could lower the shutter speed and increase the aperture. It doesn't know what I'm trying to capture. It's just kind of guessing, and I'll explain that in a sec. Now that you know a little bit more about what your camera is doing with the settings and how it can create different aesthetic effects in the final image, let's look at the auto settings, and then that way you can utilize those in certain environments and take advantage of that when you need to. You shouldn't start with the auto modes. I did this. I started with the auto modes in the beginning. If you're starting with auto modes instead of learning manual mode first, then it's kind of like a pilot that is flying airplanes with just autopilot the whole time.
Mayday! Mayday!
doesn't know how to fly the plane. He's just sitting in the front seat, and he doesn't know how to take off or land by himself at all. So you need to understand what these settings do and then use the auto modes when you need to, okay? So my first DSLR camera was a Canon 7D, and I bought that in 2010 when I decided to travel Europe for a month with my best friend from high school. I had no idea how to use it. I got it in the mail, tried to watch a lot of YouTube videos before I went on the trip. I still had no idea how to control the settings of my camera. So what I did was I got to Europe and I was trying to capture a scene, and it's like, oh, it's too bright, it's too dark. I didn't know how to control it. I was like kind of frustrated. So what I did was I ended up setting it in bracket mode, which is what you usually do for like HDR shots. You capture one underexposed, one normally exposed shot, and then one overexposed shot, and then you blend them all together in a program. But what I was doing was I was capturing it, click, 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 you know, the bracketing, and I would pick which exposure looked best and then delete the other ones that looked like crap. So I did that for a whole month. I did that. I didn't understand how to control the settings at all on my camera. Nothing. Which made it really frustrating for when I was trying to capture a nice portrait or when I wanted to capture night shots. I didn't want a lot of noise. I didn't want a lot of motion blur. I tried to go up on the Eiffel Tower and capture the city. I didn't have a tripod, and I got a lot of, camera shake, movement, ruined a bunch of shots. It was frustrating. And thankfully I did use the bracket system. It kind of helped me, but it was like, you can understand how frustrating it was. I didn't understand how to control anything, and it was like a crutch for me. After a month of click, 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 Paris was like the last stop, and my friend ended up mocking me, because he was so tired of the clicking. I'd be like, oh, let me take a picture of this real quick, and he'd be like, oh, click, 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 click. So it was just annoying for everybody around me and him, and it's just like, live and learn, I'm hoping to help you guys out so you don't run into the same frustrations that I did. One of the shots that I got in Vernazza is the Cinque Terre. It's an Italian coastal line right there, and I used my bracketing technique, that's my bracketing technique, to try and capture this panoramic shot. So I did click, 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 the whole bracket of the panoramic shot, which was super annoying. And I had it on auto mode, of course, but my camera didn't understand what the heck I was trying to capture. So you can see, I'll show you the settings. The settings are like super crazy. And when we get closer to the image, I'll show you how much noise is in the image because of the camera didn't know what the heck I wanted. So it just kind of guessed. So here's the panoramic shot of Vernazza. I'm on a trail actually walking to another city that kind of looks like this, right? Another coastal city. But, I stop, mosey around with my camera, click, 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 got my Canon 7D. I don't know how to take a proper exposure. I'm just letting the camera do all the work for me. And we can see how it just totally guesses wrong, totally screws it up. So this landscape, this shot of the city is basically motionless. Nothing is moving very fast at all. Everything's far away, so even the ocean, if it was crashing very hard over here, it's so far away, it's minimal movement, right? But look at the setting. I've got a fast shutter speed of 1/1250. That's really fast for a motionless scene. And it's not like I'm compensating for a proper exposure, because look at my aperture. It's super high too. The aperture is at f/20, and most landscape photographers can tell you that they probably never shoot their aperture that high, especially if they're shooting like sunrises. They're gonna have maybe an aperture of about f11, f13. Okay, my camera is actually just guessing what I want. The worst one is it's got ISO 6400. Why would it have an ISO of 6400? There's plenty of light. Why is the camera opting to add this much additional light? It's turning on the flashlight for no reason. It's not even dark out, we can see. Why is it turning on the flashlight for our camera? So every one of these settings is working against each other. We're increased the light here for no reason, which means we're closing down, we're increasing our aperture, making the iris a lot tighter, and we're making our camera blink a lot faster. Why? And it's because it got this ISO completely wrong, and all of our other settings are messed up. So the really bad problem is I'm shooting in JPEG because the raw files were taking up a lot of space on my cards, and I was traveling for a month, so didn't want to take up all that space on my cards, so I shot in JPEG. So I'm shooting the bracket mode on auto mode, and it's getting the ISO completely wrong. So if I wanted to print this, sure, it'd look okay. It'd look okay if I printed it, but it wouldn't be the best possible outcome. When we look closer, we can see what that 6400 ISO is doing by creating noise, in the image. Everything's kind of a little bit mushy, which some photographers might like that. It's similar to like grain in a film photo. But for me, I would rather see much more crispness, everything more in focus than this kind of soft, noisy image that I got. If I were to redo this, I would start with the aperture first. I know it's a landscape, so I'd set it to about f11. I'd probably focus on this tower, so I'd make sure I want that in focus. And then everything, right around here would be similar focus, right? That's where my focal point would be for me. And then I would adjust and just go down with my other two settings and try to create a proper exposure. I know I could go really low. I'm shooting handheld, so I know I can go to I'm with a focal length of 28 millimeters, so I could go to about 1/60th of a second and not risk that camera shake. From shooting handheld. Plus, my lens has that stabilization on it, so I could go even lower if I wanted to. But I don't need to because there's plenty of light. I would set it to about maybe 1/100, 1/60th, around there, and then I make sure the ISO is 100 as well. And then if the exposure is still too bright, I can increase the shutter speed a little bit more to get a proper exposure. So that's how I would do it if I were shooting manual, and I would go over there again. But once in a lifetime thing, probably. So right here is another landscape type of thing where it's shot at f11, and you can see how I'm focused on her, but we've got significant focus in the background. You can definitely tell what's going on in the background. It's not sharp, but it's still in focus, right? It's not super sharp, but we can tell what it is instead of it being like super blurry. So it all depends on what you're going for, right? If I used a really low aperture on this shot, she'd be in focus and this would all be blurry. It'd give a different feel to the image. It'd be more soft, and you wouldn't see the little islands in the distance, which I think is a nice little addition. So the first two auto modes, which is aperture value and time value, not counting ISO, auto ISO, those first two modes are usually used by myself in busy environments, things like that, busy events like weddings, or I used to shoot these military events. But when the light is changing rapidly, there's a lot of stress, a lot that's going on, a lot of movement, a lot of chaos in the environment. The auto modes kind of ensure that you're able to capture the image without having your exposure perfect each time with manual mode, adjusting the shutter here, adjusting the shutter there as you shoot the bride, or you zoom in and the aperture changes because your lens doesn't stay with the same aperture. It increases when you zoom in, things like that. The auto modes, like aperture value, say you're shooting a wedding and you're shooting a portrait, right? Just up close shots of the bride getting ready or whatever. You might have it in aperture value because you want those nice soft backgrounds, you want to eliminate distractions, things like that. But you might want it in time value mode, TV. You might have it in that mode when it's the ceremony and they're walking down and people are moving a lot more and you want to freeze the motion a little bit. Okay, so that's where you kind of need to know what the auto modes are doing so you can capture the subject when it's important to capture the subject and capture it how they need to be captured. Weddings, you can't really mess around, you can't really guesstimate. I had a friend, he was shooting a wedding. He knew what he was doing with portraits and things, but when it came to, he was just shooting in auto mode pretty much his whole photography career or whatever. He would capture some nice portraits with models where it's all set up and the lighting's consistent and things like that, but he actually got hired to do a wedding and he was confident that he can do it, so this business hired him to capture the bride and groom on a beach. The only problem is he shot auto mode, and the white of the bride's dress was messing up the auto exposure. The geeky part of a camera is it tries to take the lights and the darks and create a blanket of 18% gray, right? And that creates a proper exposure. That's the dumb geeky part of it, right? So it's taking the lights and the darks, making a proper exposure, telling your camera what a proper exposure is, and then you're capturing it. But what it doesn't know is that there's a bride there with a really white dress, and it's actually it's saying, oh, there's too much light here, we gotta decrease this exposure so we get a proper exposure, right? But when that happens and the camera's reading it that way and you capture it, the image is going to be a little bit darker because it's compensating for that bright white of the dress. Same with snowy fields and things like that. So if you don't understand the way these auto modes work, you're not going to capture the subject the way you need to capture the subject. So in that case, if you wanted to control the way the computer on his camera was reading the exposure, if he looked at his LCD and saw that it was too dark, he could actually adjust the EV dial. There's a little dial when you're using auto modes like AV, TV, P mode, auto ISO. It depends on what camera, but usually it's this dial, one of these dials that controls the EV, and that's the exposure value. So you can tell your camera, increase the exposure by 1 stop, increase the exposure by 2 stops, whatever you need it to do to actually capture it the way you need to capture it, not the way the camera thinks you need to capture it. So there's a little bit of control when you're using these auto modes if you know what that EV dial does, okay? Find your manual and you'll find which dial it is, which setting it is. You need to understand that setting, the EV setting, if you're shooting in these auto modes, because your camera's not always going to guess the appropriate exposure. So anyway, needless to say, that the guy, he came to me and he's like, well, what's going on? I shot in auto mode. Why did it capture all these images underexposed? What's going on here? And I had explained to him what the camera is trying to do, and that his employers were correct, that all of them are dark and they're all bad images. And he got fired. He wasn't hired back for that job. So if he knew how to control his auto mode, or if he knew how to shoot in manual or control the EV dial, to adjust the auto modes, then, maybe he could be a successful wedding photographer. It sucks, It just takes someone to tell you about things before you can actually do them, right? You're not going to be like an epiphany, oh, there's an EV dial that I didn't know about this whole time. No, someone has to introduce you to it and teach you properly how to use manual modes, use auto modes, and capture what you're envisioning. Someone has to teach you properly. So hopefully you're finding that value in this video. Alright, so now you should be really familiar with the settings, what the shutter speed does, what the aperture does, what ISO does, and now we can get more creative and look at more creative techniques that you can apply when you're shooting with your camera or using a flash, things like that. So this first one is a long exposure with a woman in the river. And let's look at the settings. We've got f1.4, which is a very shallow depth of field, the lowest aperture my lens will go, and the shutter speed is 5 seconds long. That's quite a long time for a shutter to be open with a human being in the image. The whole time the eye of the camera is open, it's capturing movement. So we've got ISO set at 640. So we've got a really low aperture, we've got a really low shutter speed, but since it's such a dark environment, I'm actually shooting in the jungle with this model. It's a dark environment, so my aperture is the lowest it could go, letting in a lot of light. The shutter speed is letting in 5 seconds of light, but I still need more light. Still need to turn on the camera's quote-unquote flashlight and turn up the ISO to 640. I used a low aperture to increase the blurriness, right? To have more blurriness. Aperture, how much blur, kind of rhymes, right? How much blur do you want? Okay, and I want to capture the movement of the river, so I use the shutter speed to 5 seconds, which is a long time, but if you have a tripod, that's the key. You're using a tripod, so I've got the tripod set up, it's sitting in the river, and then I have a 2-second timer on my shutter button, so it doesn't capture any of that camera shake. It counts down to 2 seconds, and then it takes the picture. So I push the button, I say, okay, ready, hold your breath, and then the model holds her breath for 5 seconds, and I tell her when it's done. But you can see there's a little bit of motion blur, like her eyes aren't as crisp, a little bit of motion blur within that 5 seconds, but it's not enough to ruin the image. And you can see how sharp her legs are, right? Because they're resting on this rock. They're a lot less motion in her legs as opposed to like her hand, which is moving in the water, her head, which is bobbing, back and forth like that. But overall, it's a successful image, and it's exactly what I wanted to go for with settings and what I envisioned. Now, this is another kind of tricky one, a little bit longer exposure with longer shutter speeds, but this one's taken in broad daylight. So usually when there's broad daylight, there's way too much light to get a long exposure like this. How did I get a long exposure in broad daylight when I'm getting over a 1 second exposure with the shutter speed, and then I've got a pretty low aperture also? So the key to that is using an ND filter. It's a neutral density filter, and it's basically like sunglasses for your lens, and it allows you to capture these longer exposures, which is kind of a cool little trick. Some of them are better than others. I would go for I think it's B+W. The more expensive ones are going to be a little bit more clear. So I had sunglasses on my lens basically with the ND filter. My shutter speed was 1.3. The aperture was relatively low, so I got some nice blurriness in the background, and then the lowest ISO setting I could have. And then with the 1.3 shutter speed, it's able to capture just a little bit of movement in the wave and then in her hair. And all I do is basically just tell her to stay as still as she could and count down, and timed everything and told her when it was done. So you can see how the coral is a lot more sharp than her dress here, because there's more movement there, and the rock isn't moving at all because I'm using a tripod. So that's another technique you can use, is the ND filter. Now when you use these longer exposures in weddings to capture the excitement of the event, the reception where everybody's dancing, you want to capture them plus a little bit of light effects. So what I'll do is I'll turn on my LCD and I'll turn the flash off. That way I can get a nice reading on the ambient light. And I put the aperture on about f8. This one's at f5, but usually I'll go like f5.6 to f8, to reduce some of the blurriness, because sometimes I'm capturing groups in the wedding, dancing, things like that, multiple people, so I want less blurriness. So I'll set the aperture to about 5.6 or so, and then I will watch in the LCD, and I'll set the ISO to 100, the lowest setting, and then the final adjustment that I'm going to make is the shutter speed. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to base it off of the ambient light in the scene. And since my flash is off, it allows me to see the scene without some additional ISO compensation thing. If you've shot with flash, you know what it does when you turn on your LCD. Sometimes it adds more light just so you can see what's going on, but it's not the actual final image. So turn your flash off, control the aperture first, turn the ISO all the way down, and then adjust the shutter speed to allow as much ambient light as you want for the environment and the effect you're going for. And typically what I've found, increase your shutter speed and you'll see how like the disco lights are getting darker and darker and darker. That's the ambient light. So increase your shutter speed just so those are letting out just enough light to create a motion effect in the final image, kind of like this, right? So that's like a 2-second exposure. That's a little bit long for weddings, because you can see how it's going over the face. You probably don't want to cover the face of the subject. You want kind of more of like a lighting effect to capture the subject, but you still have the lighting effects in the background. It's not covering their face, unless that's the look you're going for. Sometimes it can look cool, like right here I think it looks cool. Now turn your flash back on, take a test image, go and get close to someone about 5 feet away, focus on them, take your shot, and then right when you take that shot, the flash is going to freeze the subject, and then what you do is you have like a 1/5 of a second to twist your wrist just a little bit, and it's going to add that motion to add the light effects. Now if the lights aren't as cool as you want, or if you're getting too much light, what you'll do is you'll increase your shutter speed, which will decrease the ambient light. If you're increasing your shutter speed, you're making your camera blink faster, and it's going to see less of that light. Okay, so that's what you want to do. All right, so thank you so much for joining in. Hopefully you're more confident in shooting manual. I really hope you go out and try this, or if you need to, watch this video a couple more times and go over the steps that you might be missing. But definitely get to know how to shoot in manual and capture the image that you're envisioning in your head. I hope that helps you out, and if you like it, give it a big thumbs up. Also, check out some other videos. You might like those too. But thanks so much for the support. I really appreciate everything, and I will see you in the next video. All right, guys, take care.